Brethren, do you remember when you first entered into a relationship with God? When you first began the establishment of a covenant with God in a personal way in your own life? You know, as you think back, I can think back, probably most of you can, to the time when the truth of God first began to make sense to you. And you began to listen to that and to read and to check into it and to come to a point where you were convicted of the truth of God. There came a time when you moved beyond just the matter of being academically convinced to really beginning to be convicted by the Spirit of God that you could no longer do some of the things that you used to do. It began to work on you. And you knew that you were confronted with changes that you had to make in your life. And in the aftermath of struggling with that and coming to grips with it, because most likely some of the changes that you knew you were going to have to make were not going to be convenient. They were not changes that were going to help you fit in better with all of your neighbors. They were not changes that were going to make it somehow easier for you to just get along with everybody else, because some of the changes that you could see from the Scriptures you were going to have to make were going to bring you into conflict with people. You were no longer going to be observing some of the same customs. You were no longer going to be able to do some of the same things. And so you began to wrestle in your life. Maybe you had family problems. You knew that it was going to cause division in your family. You know, one of the things I very vividly remember in my mind is the first Christmas that I did not keep. That's a very vivid memory to me because it was something that served to disrupt and to upset the family. And I wasn't trying to do that. I thought the thing for me to do was just sort of keep a low profile, stay out of everybody's way. I wasn't trying to stop them from doing it. But the fact that I wasn't caught up in the spirit of the occasion, the fact that I didn't want to participate, meant that before the day was over, my mother was in tears and my brother was shaking his fist in my face and saying, "I hope you're satisfied. You're just wrecking this whole family." Well, you know, that doesn't feel very good. And yet, you know, when you know, and you know that God says, as He does in Deuteronomy 12, learn not the way of the heathen. Don't inquire after them, saying, how did those nations serve their gods? Even so will I do to the Lord my God. For all the things that they've done to their gods, I hate, God says. They're an abomination to me. And I read that, and I saw that, and I knew that I couldn't participate. But you know, first we come to a point where we're convinced of the truth. It makes sense. It fits. I remember the first couple of booklets that I ever got entitled, Who is the Beast in the United States and Britain in Prophecy? Now those booklets were interesting to me. And they were exciting, and that was interesting knowledge. But you know, it didn't really require any changes in my life. I could keep on going to the Baptist church. I could keep on doing the things I was doing. Those two booklets didn't change my life except in the sense that they awakened my attention to the fact that there was a lot in the Bible that I didn't know about. And I began then to write in for more booklets and began reading, the Plain Truth magazine and listening more to the broadcast and doing these various things. But as time went on, I began to, there were other booklets about do you have an immortal soul or is heaven the reward of the saved? And again, those were interesting booklets. But they didn't change what I did in my personal life from a day-to-day basis. But I well remember when I read the booklet, which day is the Christian Sabbath? Because you see, that confronted me with something that was not just interesting information, was not just something I knew that some other people didn't know. It was information that required a change in my life. It required me to start doing something I hadn't been doing and to stop doing something that I was currently doing. And I'm sure you remember, as you began to study through certain things and we began to confront issues, So we moved from being convinced in an academic sense, as God's Spirit began to work with our minds, to be convicted of the truth. To where it wasn't something you could simply read and lay on a shelf and go on about your business as though nothing had happened. But as God's Spirit began to work with you and convict you, you were faced with the necessity of beginning to make changes in your life. Now, for some of us, it took a longer time, for others a shorter time. But we went through and we struggled and we wrestled in whatever way we had to, and different things were bigger obstacles for some of us. We had to come to a point of making a commitment in our heart and in our mind, of beginning to enter into a relationship with God. And that was a monumental turning point, a pivotal point in each of our lives. The Bible tells of many individuals who entered into a relationship with God. But I want to focus our attention at the beginning of the sermon on one specific individual, because there's something to be learned from this relationship that he established. Let me ask you another question in regards to the relationship that you established with God. Did you ever fall down on your part of the bargain? Have you lived up completely to what you told God you were going to do at that time when you meant it? I know that I haven't. And I don't think there's any of us sitting here that can say that we have perfectly lived up to and achieved everything that we aspired to at that time we entered into a covenant with God. Well, there's a particular man that I want to focus our attention on here at the beginning of the sermon, who went through an experience that all of us can learn from. And as we approach the spring festival season, we're approaching a time of renewal. And it's a time to think very deeply of the lesson that this man learned. Now, you remember the story of a man named Jacob. We pick up the story, as we are, and we're going to pick it up in Genesis 28. Now, Jacob had been born as a twin, Jacob and Esau. You remember the story. God had intended from the beginning that Jacob would be the one through whom he would work. Now, that illustrates the sovereignty and the election of God. God chooses. You and I aren't here because we're the smartest people or the best people or this people or that people. We're here first and foremost because God has chosen in your life and in mine to open our minds to understand His truth. Now, we've had a part in it. We've had to respond. We have had to accept and to respond to the initiative that God took. But God took the initiative. God took the initiative in your life and in mine. Took the initiative in Jacob's life. And you remember the story. Jacob was impatient, didn't want to wait on God. And so he connived and tricked his brother Esau, and it sort of culminated in his having tricked his elderly father Isaac into conveying the blessing to him. And when Esau found out, he was very upset. He was very mad. Isaac, of course, realized that even though what Jacob did was wrong, that really it was of God because it had been known from the beginning. And Isaac really had not wanted it to work out that way because Esau was his favorite. He had a special bond with Esau, and he had really wanted somehow for it to work out for Esau to have the blessing. But God had prophesied before the boys were ever born that that the elder would serve the younger, that Esau would be servant to Jacob, that Jacob would receive the birthright. So Isaac, when all these things culminated, Isaac knew that this really was of God in the overall sense, and that how it was supposed to have done. So anyway, Esau was mad, and he was ready to get revenge. And so we read in Genesis chapter 28 and verse 1 that Isaac called Jacob and he blessed him. And he charged him and he said, "Now don't take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padan Aram, the house of Bethuel, your mother's father. and take you a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So he charged him in this way, and he says, God Almighty bless you, make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be a multitude of people, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your seed with you, that you may inherit the land wherein you are a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham. So anyway, we find that Jacob, in verse 10, went down from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place, and he tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took the stones of the place, and he set them for his pillows. And he laid down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. In this dream, he saw a ladder that was set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending. And the Eternal stood above it. And he said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land whereon you lie, to you will I give it, and to your seed, and your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you in all your places where you go, and will bring you again into this land. For I will not leave you until I have done that which I have spoken to you of. Well, when Jacob awakened, he was really shaken by this dream. And he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. You know, this is one thing to understand. At this point in his life, Jacob knew about God, but Jacob did not really know God. Jacob was a wheeler-dealer. He was a conniver. Jacob was a man that had a superficial knowledge of God. He knew about the laws of God. He knew about the truth of God. Jacob was as many young people who have grown up in the church. He grew up in the family of Abraham, in the family of Isaac. He knew about God. But you don't have to read very far to realize that Jacob had not taken, previous to this time, God's way very seriously as it personally impacted him. Oh, he sort of went along with most of the things, but he was not deeply personally convicted. He did not have a deep personal relationship with God. It was a superficial relationship. It was a relationship sort of through his father Isaac. And he spent the night here, and he had this graphic dream, a vision as it were. And he woke up in the morning and was really shaken by it, because it was the first real experience that he had had with the true God. Well, he had known about God all his life. But now God was beginning to work with Jacob in a personal way. First, he began to get Jacob's attention. Then, as you go on through the story, he began to humble Jacob, to let Jacob sort of hit a bottom. Because, you know, sometimes we have to come to a point in our lives where we're capable of coming to repentance. As long as we're sort of whizzing along and everything's going our way, and we can wheel and deal and maneuver and somehow work things out. You know, we sort of have God sitting in the back seat. You know, so sometimes you see the little bumper sticker, you know, God is my co-pilot. Well, what you really need to do is get out of the pilot seat and let God be the pilot. Because, you know, that's what a lot of people want him to do. Sit over there in the next seat, keep quiet, don't say anything, and if we run into real trouble, then, you know, we'll turn the controls over for a little while and let him sort of steady the airplane, and then we'll take it back. You know, that's sort of the way human nature works. We want to basically do it our way, unless we really get in the jam and we really get scared, and at that point, we're ready to hand it over. And once things settle down, if we're not careful, we're ready to take it back. Well, Jacob had some lessons to learn, and you remember the story. God let him fall into the hands of a man that, well, if certain traits run in families, Jacob ran into the guy that had the real concentration of it in his family. Jacob was a wheeler-dealer, but when he ran into his uncle Laban, he ran into the wheeler-dealer of all wheeler-dealers. And Laban was a shyster from the word go, and he taught Jacob some things about wheeling and dealing. And frankly, as ultimately was the case, if God hadn't been with Jacob, he'd have come out on the raw end, and Jacob finally knew it. He knew when it ultimately ended up that he was not successful because of how smart he was. And that's an important step for us to all come to, you see. Because if I think I'm where I am in some positive way because of me, because I did it, and I managed this, and the big I, only pronoun we capitalize in English, sort of interesting. You know, we don't capitalize you, he or him or she or her. We just capitalize I because that's really what's important, right? Well, that may not be the whole story, but it does sort of illustrate a certain characteristic of human nature and the way we look at things. Jacob had a lesson to learn. But Jacob was introduced here to God, and God established certain promises. And Jacob was really shaken. He woke up and he said, I didn't know God was here. And he was afraid. Verse 17, he said, how dreadful is this place, or full of awe and terror. He was really overwhelmed by it. He says, this is none other but the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. He rose up early in the morning and he took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and he set it up for a pillar. And he poured oil upon the top of it, anointed it. And he called the name of the place Bethel. Bethel, the house of God. The name of the city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Eternal be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you shall give me, I will surely give the tenth unto you. Now here was Jacob trying to cut a deal with God. Think about it, you know. Jacob says, look, he says, have I got a deal for you? You take care of me. Make sure nothing bad happens to me. Bring me back safely. And if everything works out well and you keep your end of the bargain, eventually, well, you know, I get back here and finally get back to my father's house in peace. Well, then, at that time, I'm really going to get serious and I'm going to start worshiping you. You're going to be my God. I'm going to start tithing, the whole thing. So Jacob went on his way. And, you know, he thought he had left God at Bethel. By the time Laban got through with him, he was glad that he hadn't. Because he went down, you know, and he didn't take him long to fall in love with Laban's beautiful daughter, Rachel. And he wanted to marry Rachel. And Laban said, have I got a deal for you? 7 years. You don't have, 7 years you work for me and you can have my daughter. Well, we're told that the 7 years just flew by. Jacob was in love and this was great. You remember the story. When he got through, Laban said, oh, by the way, we've got a custom in this country. I guess I forgot to mention it. The firstborn daughter always has to get married first. So, here's Leah. Of course, he had already palmed Leah off, and somehow or another, Jacob, the wedding night festivity must have gotten pretty lively or something, because Jacob evidently didn't know what was going on until the next morning, and then he was mad. He came hunting for Laban. Laban said, oh, we've got this custom. You didn't know? You've lived here? Well, sorry about that. I meant to tell you. Tell you what. If I got a deal for you, another 7 years, and you can have Rachel. Well, Jacob did it. Then he got through, and by that time he had 2 wives, and he had a bunch of kids, and he had no way to support them. And Laban said, hey, have I got a deal for you? You work for me, manage my flock, we'll cut a deal. Some of it will be yours and some of it will be mine. And, of course, we go on through and you read the story and you find that Laban actually changed Jacob's wages 10 different times. Every time Jacob started to get ahead on the deal, Laban came back and rewrote the contract. Maybe some of you have worked for a guy like that. He had it all figured out and you thought you had it figured out, and as soon as you started making some money, all of a sudden, no, that's not the way we intended it. Look, here, we're going to rewrite the contract. Well, finally, Jacob left. He got out of there and had this confrontation with Laban and went on and left. But Jacob came back. He returned. As you go through the through the story, and in chapter 32, and he wrestled with God as he had this tenacity, and he reconciled with Esau, and life went on. And Jacob had evidently never really fully come to grips with the covenant he made with God. He went through various problems, and we pick up the story in Genesis 35. In Genesis 35 and verse 1, God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God, God that appeared unto you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. It was time for Jacob to come to grips with the promises he had made. Jacob had undoubtedly been serious when he said it. He had had good intentions. He had had his ups and downs in terms of a relationship with God. But Jacob had allowed things to drift in his family. So notice, that's apparent as we read the story here, because notice, as God told Jacob, He said, you need to arise and go back to Bethel. You need to go back to your starting point. You need to go back to that place where you first entered into a covenant with me. And you need to renew that covenant. You need to come to a point of renewal in your life. You need a fresh start. You need to arise and go to Bethel. So Jacob said unto his household in Genesis 35:2, and to all that were with him, he said, put away the strange gods that are among you. Now, you sort of get the idea right at the start. You see that things had fallen down in the family of Jacob. There were various of the family members that had idols that they had brought with them or that they had gotten in transit. He says, put away the strange gods that are among you. Be clean and change your garments. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hands, and all their earrings which were in their ears. Now that's referring specifically to the sons. I might just make comment that that was never an Israelitish custom, but it was something that Israel picked up from some of the nations around. You find that basically it was an Egyptian custom that the Ishmaelites popularized there. In fact, there's even a reference back in the book of Judges that in Judges chapter 8, making reference to the fact that that was one of the outward signs of these Ishmaelites. In Judges 8:24, Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you. You would give me every man the earrings of his prey. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. See, after these Ishmaelites, he collected them and made something else out of them. But the point was that was not something that the Israelites did, but the Ishmaelites around them did, which they had adopted from the Egyptians. So it was a way that they sort of stood out. Well, here Jacob's sons had evidently picked up some of this sort of worldly custom that was not what God intended His people to do. So notice in Genesis 35:4, they gave unto Jacob the strange gods that were in their hand, and all the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. There came a point, as he said, we need to go back to Bethel to renew our relationship with God. And he called his sons together. And he said, if we want God's blessing, we've got to renew our relationship with God. And God, who has saved me in the day of my distress and the day of my affliction, I need to go back and renew a relationship with God. And so he said, now if we're going to renew a relationship with God, we can't come just as we are. Because you see, the problem was they had blended in with the world around them. They had blended in with the customs and the practices of the Ishmaelites and the other people who dwelt in that immediate vicinity. They had taken on the outward trappings of the world around them. You couldn't tell where the people of God started and the world stopped. So Jacob said, we need to go back to Bethel. We need to renew a relationship with God. But a starting point of that is we've got to clean up our act. We've got to get rid of the things that we have collected from the world around us that do not reflect God's values. We need to put those things away. Now, what those things are in each of our lives are things for us to examine. But you see, the point is there. Jacob recognized the need to get back to the basics, to go back to Bethel, to renew a relationship with God, and he knew that the starting point was we've got to clean up our act. We've got to examine our lives and get rid of the things that separate us from God, get rid of the things that we have picked up from the world around us that are not reflective of God's values. And so he collected these things and he dug a hole and he buried them in the ground. He said, we can't drag all this stuff back to Bethel. God doesn't want you showing up looking that way. He doesn't want all these little idols and little figurines and all this sort of junk. God doesn't want, we can't traipse back to Bethel and bring all of that stuff. They had these things. They'd maybe brought some of them with them. They had accumulated others along the wayside. You know what we have to do if we're going to go back to Bethel? To renew that relationship with God, if we're going to go back to Bethel, we've got to get rid of all the idols. We've got to get rid of all the trappings of the world that separate us from God and that reflect a totally different set of priorities and values than what God has. We have to be clean. We have to clean up. Now, they cleaned up physically, but certainly that is to illustrate the point of cleaning up spiritually. Not that we aren't to be clean physically, but it was a spiritual principle that was illustrated as well. So Jacob said, let's put away these things. And let's arise and go to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto the God who answered me in the day of my distress. Jacob had entered into a relationship with God when he was in trouble, when he was scared. But you see, he realized that the time had come to renew that relationship because Jacob had not perfectly followed through on what he had promised. And he had a need to make good on those promises. As we enter this time of the year, it's an important time for us to think back to our Bethel. To that time when we came to an encounter with God. And we made certain promises to God. It's a time for us to evaluate what things do we need to get rid of and bury under the oak tree as we arise and go to Bethel. And they journeyed, verse 5, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. You know, when you're really doing what God says, God will bless you and protect you. And they started down into what was enemy territory. Maybe one of the things that had kept Jacob from going back was because it was not a nice neighborhood through which he had to pass. You know, he and the family didn't want to get mugged on the way down by all these, outlaw bands and vigilantes and all these groups that were around there. And, various excuses that can come in our way as to things we're afraid of, or things that are obstacles, or things that are reasons or excuses as to why it is we can't go back and do what we're supposed to do right now. But interestingly, when Jacob really got serious, God took care of the problems. The fear of God came upon all the cities near around. We're not told what God did to throw the fear into them, but evidently nobody wanted to mess with Jacob when he went by. Did they see a great towering angel with a flaming sword or something? I don't know what they saw. Maybe they saw something like Balaam's ass saw. But whatever they saw, it threw the fear of God into them, and they left Jacob alone. And he journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities round about, and they didn't pursue after the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, which was in the land of Canaan, that is Bethel. he and all the people that were with him, and he built there an altar. And he called the place El Bethel, the God of Bethel, because there God appeared unto him when he fled from the face of his brother. And we find that God appeared again unto Jacob, and he blessed him. And God said unto him, Your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And he called his name Israel. And God said unto him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come out of you, and kings shall come out of your loins. And the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, to you will I give it, and to your seed after you will I give it. And God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, even a pillar of stone. Poured a drink offering thereon, and he poured oil thereon. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke unto him, Bethel. Jacob needed to arise and go to Bethel. He needed to make good on the agreement that he had made with God. He needed to renew his covenant. He had gotten slack and careless in some of its ways. As the years had passed, Jacob had had his ups and downs. You know, brethren, God is consistent. But unfortunately, we're not. We have our ups and downs. There comes a time in each of our lives where we need to arise and go up to Bethel, realizing that if we're going to do that, we've got to bury the things that we have accumulated that do not reflect God's ways and God's will and God's values. We've got to get rid of those things. We've got to clean up. We've got to make changes. We've got to be clean and go up to Bethel to renew that relationship. As we approach the Passover season, we're coming to a time when we are reminded once again of the covenant into which we've entered. Just as God delivered Jacob from distress, God delivered his descendants, the people of Israel, from distress. You read of it back in Exodus 12, where God spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and he said, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And he began to instruct the children of Israel, all the congregation, telling them that they were to select out a lamb for a house. And then they were to save it up until the 14th day of the first month. This is verse 6. And the congregation was to kill it in the evening, or as the literal Hebrew is, between the two evenings, during that period of sunset till total darkness. During that period of dusk, they would kill the lamb and roast it. They were to take of the blood and strike it on the doorposts. And they were to eat the flesh that night. And they were to eat it, verse 11, in haste. It is the eternal's Passover. Because, as it says in verse 12 of Exodus 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgment. I am the eternal. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague will not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. This day shall be unto you for a memorial. You shall keep it a feast to the eternal throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. It is a memorial. And it is observed as a memorial. And then for 7 days they were to eat unleavened bread. Even the first day they were to put away the leavening out of their homes. And they were forbidden to eat leavened bread from the first day until the seventh. The first day, verse 16, was to be a holy convocation, and the seventh day was a holy convocation. So we find that they were to do this, and they were to observe it forever. It is the Lord's Passover, verse 27. And in verse 29, at midnight, the Eternal smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Now this was the culmination of the plagues of Egypt, as God was preparing to deliver His people from affliction. And so God then brought them out of Egypt in a powerful way with miracles. The death angel passed through the land, and it smote the firstborn of man and beast, smitten dead. Only those who were under the blood of the Lamb were freed, were exempted from death. And God then began to bring Israel out of Egypt. We find that verse 37, that they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, 600,000 on foot. This completed, as it says in verse 40 of chapter 12, a 430-year period from the time God had first made the promises to Abraham, or confirmed them, as it were, when Abraham was 99, and that 430 years later, they were all brought up out of the land of Egypt. Verse 42, it is a night to be much observed unto the Eternal, for bringing them up from the land of Egypt. It is that night of the Lord to be observed to all the children of Israel and all their generations. So we have the Passover, and then we have that night to be much observed that commemorates the beginning of the Exodus, because that's what occurred, as we're told back in the book of Numbers. Numbers 33, verse 3, it says, they departed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. The Egyptians buried all their firstborn, which the Lord had smitten among them. Upon their gods also the Eternal executed judgment. So, they came out on the morrow, on the 15th day of the first month. That's what it says, 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. They came out on the day after the Passover. Well, we're told back in Deuteronomy 16 in verse 1, observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover unto the Eternal your God, for in the month of Abib the Eternal your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. Well, they came out on the 15th. They came out on the morrow after the Passover. They came out by night, a night to be much observed. So there was the Passover. They were to stay in their homes, you see, because the death angel passed through at midnight. And then, in the wee hours of the morning, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. They appeared there by the early morning. You know, they didn't hop in their car and drive 10 minutes down the road. That's not the way it worked. They didn't get on the telephone and call up. He had to send messengers, and the messengers had to arrive, and Moses and Aaron then left and went to the palace, and then they came back and gave word to the people to assemble and to spoil the Egyptians. Well, by this time, here we were in the early morning hours. You know, it was daylight, and they were out gathering their stuff, spoiling the Egyptians, gathering all the material, getting ready, organizing by ranks. And so then, as the 15th day of the first month began, that evening, they came out by night, a night to be much observed. They were brought forth out of Egypt by night on the 15th day of the first month, the morrow after the Passover. Now, by the time of Christ, and that's a different story, maybe we'll go into that in a future sermon, the Jews had come to, as a national practice, to sort of confuse the two together, the Passover and the night to be much observed. But we find here that the days of unleavened bread were to be observed. Now, the days of unleavened bread, what do we learn out of that? You know, there are three things that we're told. Back in Exodus 12, we're told they were not to have leavening seen with them in all their homes. So they were to have disposed of the leavening. We were also told that they were not to eat of any leavening during those 7 days. It was the 7 days of unleavened bread. They were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So there were three things. They were to get rid of the leavening, They were not to eat leavening, and they were to replace it with something else, which was unleavened bread. Now that ties right in with the renewal of our covenant with exactly what Jacob did when he returned to Bethel. You see, what did he do? He got rid of the things that had been accumulated in his life that shouldn't have been there. He called his family together and he says, we've got changes to make. We've got things to get rid of. And I'm going to dig a hole under this oak tree and we're going to bury those things. Now give me your little idols. You boys take off the earrings and throw those in. And let's accumulate these things that we have gotten together that we shouldn't have. And let's put them in this hole. And let's bury it and cover it over. And let's be clean. And let's return to Bethel. And let us there renew a relationship. When we go through the process, as we do over the next 3 weeks of beginning to unleaven bread, yes, we are to unleaven, and yes, we are to unleaven physically. It's not simply a metaphor. The Scripture is very plain that we are to unleaven. It says so. But we are to learn a spiritual lesson from that unleavening. The whole point of the days of unleavened bread is not just simply that you clean out your house, that you get rid of the breadcrumbs. That is a physical means of teaching a spiritual lesson. Because you see what we need to be doing. It's saying, what is the spiritual leavening that we have in our lives? What are the things that we have that need to be gotten rid of, that need to be buried under that oak tree in Shechem? What are the things that need to be left behind? That need to be gotten rid of and disposed? So that we can return to Bethel and renew and enter back into that covenant with God. Renew that covenant. You know, Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he talked about the feast. You know, there are those who are confused. They don't think the feast is mentioned in the New Testament. Well, it's mentioned in a lot of places. And one question, of course, we ought to ask ourselves, how many times does God need to repeat Himself? You know, some people think unless God says it on every page, well, hey, you didn't tell me today. I mean, you only told me yesterday. Is that the way we want our children to be? You know, you got to run through the list of everything you expect of them every morning, lest they think, well, all that doesn't apply anymore. See, that's all done away because you said that yesterday. Well, God doesn't have to repeat Himself over and over every day. Shouldn't have to. You know, if we find it, how many times does God have to say it in order for it to be binding? I mean, if God says it once, isn't that enough? If our desire is to be conformed to the image of God, to reflect God in our inner life, in our heart, and in our mind, once we find what God wants, isn't that sufficient? Does He have to tell us over and over and over and over? Well, in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 2, Paul tells the Corinthians that they were puffed up. Spiritually, they were puffed up. They had a false concept of love. They confused love with tolerance for sin. Here was an individual who was living in blatant immorality. And they had an attitude of tolerance. God loves the sinner. But God has zero tolerance for sin. And that, of course, ties in with the message of the Passover, because sin, your sin and my sin, cost the life of Jesus Christ. He died that we might not have to. So God has zero tolerance for sin. Sin took the life of Jesus Christ. He took your place and mine. God commended His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. An attitude of tolerance for sin cheapens the sacrifice of Christ. When we have an attitude that treats sin with tolerance and indifference and says, well, hey, it's no big deal. What we're really saying, what we're really doing is minimizing the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, as though that were of little value. Well, the Corinthians needed correction. He told them they were puffed up spiritually. He had already made a decision and instructed that this individual be disfellowshipped here for this immorality. And in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 5, Paul said, "Your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened." Now, brethren, how were they? Puffed up. Spiritually, they were puffed up. How were they unleavened? The only way that I know you can be unleavened is either spiritually or physically. Can you think of another way to take it? If you can, let me know. I'm honest and sincere about it. I mean, if you can think of a third meaning, well, let me know after services. But the only way I can understand to take it is he's either speaking in a spiritual sense or he's speaking literally and physically. Well, he just got through saying they were puffed up. And he says you need to get rid of this so you can be unleavened, even as you are unleavened. How were they unleavened? They were physically unleavened, and they needed to become spiritually unleavened by getting rid of this little leaven, this sin that puffed them up. Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. And what do? In the aftermath of the Passover, we take the Passover and we proceed on to celebrate the days of unleavened bread. God takes the initiative, but we have to respond. God passed over, had the death angel pass over His people. It passed through the land of Egypt, passed over those who were under the blood of the Lamb. And they were exempted from death. But brethren, why were they exempted from death? Was it so they could remain in Egypt? Did God save them for death? Did God save them from death so they could remain in Egypt? Oh no. He saved them from death so they could come out of Egypt. So they could make an exodus, an outcoming. That's what the word exodus literally means. Same root word as we get our word exit from. To go out from. The book of Exodus is the book of going out from. That's what we have to do. We have to go out from. We have to come out of the world. Now, Paul told the church, he says, "Purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast." Oh, somebody wants a New Testament command? Here it is. Let us therefore keep the feast. You show me one that says, let us therefore keep Christmas? Let us therefore keep the feast, not with old leaven. You don't keep the feast with, with Wonder Bread and Twinkies, do you? You don't keep the feast with old leaven. Neither do you keep it with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. No more than you keep the feast with old physical leavening, do you... See, that's to teach us something. We're not to keep it with old spiritual leavening. We're not to keep it with the leavening of malice and wickedness. We're to keep it with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, is that totally and completely a New Testament concept? Well, it is a New Testament concept. But, it's also an Old Testament concept. Let's go back to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 24. See, time after time, the people of God have always had to come back to Bethel. Now, Bethel has maybe been different places for different people. But we've all had to do. We've all had to do what Jacob did. We've had to come to a time in our life when we examine things, we look at it and we say, I haven't lived up to everything I promised God. I've got some things I need to bury under the oak tree and leave behind. I've got some things that I need to clean out of my life. And I need to arise and go back to Bethel. In one sense, every year at the Passover, we have a chance of renewal. A chance of a new beginning. It's interesting that over and over, when God mentions the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, He mentions with it the name of the month. the month Abib. You shall observe the month Abib. Now, if you look that up, the word Abib means literally green ears. It has to do with new growth, fresh shoots of green new growth that come forth in the spring. The spring festival season is the time of new growth. It's the time of a fresh start. It's the time of new beginning. After the barrenness of winter, the green sprouts begin to come forth. It's exciting to see. You know, you plant a garden and you look out there and here's the rows and here's the dirt. You look and finally you see those little green shoots beginning to come up. New life. A fresh start, a new beginning. A time for growth to begin. That's what it is spiritually too. In Joshua 24, Joshua, we're told in verse 1 of Joshua 24, gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. Now, that's where Jacob had buried all the stuff under the oak tree, you remember? He gathered them to Shechem, Joshua did, hundreds of years later. He called for the elders and for their heads and for their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said unto them, Thus says the eternal God of Israel, your fathers who dwelt on the other side of the flood, it's translated in the King James, literally the other side of the river, beyond the Euphrates, speaking of the family of Jacob. Your fathers, your ancestors, dwelt beyond the river in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor. And they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river and led him throughout all the land of Canaan and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac, and gave unto Isaac Jacob and Esau. Jacob and his children went down to Egypt, and I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt. And I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued. They cried unto the Eternal, and He put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them, and covered them. Verse 8, I brought you into the land of the Amorites, which dwelt on the other side of the Jordan, and I gave them into your hand. Verse 10, I wouldn't hearken unto Balaam, and he blessed you, and I delivered you out of his hand. You went over the Jordan and came unto Jericho. Verse 12, I sent the hornet before you, and they drove out all that were before you. Verse 13, I gave you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build. And you dwell in the vineyards, the olive yards which you planted, which you planted not, do you eat. Now therefore serve the Eternal, fear the Eternal, and serve Him in sincerity and in truth. Oh, that's what Paul said. We were to eat the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Here Joshua told them they were to stand in awe of God and serve Him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt, and serve you the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we shall serve the Eternal. Verse 23, Joshua told them, Now therefore put away the strange gods which are among you, and incline your heart unto the eternal God of Israel. People said unto Joshua, The Lord our God will we serve, and His voice will we obey. Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And we find in verse 31 that Israel served the Eternal all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. So they served him for a short time on beyond, as long as Joshua lived and the elders there with him. Over and over again, there has been that need for renewal. And there has, of course, been a difference between those who knew about God and those who knew God. As we come here to the Passover season and to the days of unleavened bread, as we begin the process of unleavening our homes, we need to think in terms of unleavening our lives. We need to think in terms of getting rid of the false gods. The gods that, as he says, the strange gods that are among you. What are the strange gods that are among us? Well, I don't think very many of us have, some leering Buddha sitting on the wall or some crucifix hanging up there or something of that sort. But you know, our gods, or whatever it is to which we give loyalty and allegiance and devotion, they're the things that we worship. Some people, it may be money. Some, it may be status. It may be the opinion of other people. It may be all sorts of things. You see, that's something you and I have to examine in our own lives. That's something we have to go through in our lives, on our knees before God, and examine what are the strange gods we've accumulated in our lives. Are there things that we need to bury under the oak tree? Are there things that we need to root out, to get rid of? Influences that have come in, compromises we've made with the world, ways in which we've watered down the way of God and the truth of God. Have we started down that pathway of compromise? You know, brethren, that's something that we have to continually go back to over and over. It's not a one-time thing. Well, it's a decision. It's a one-time decision, but we have to renew that decision. We have to step back and evaluate. We have to look. We have to examine. Jacob had to. The people of God, down through time, over and over and over. We find in the context, as we go through the Scripture, particularly in the book of Chronicles, we find over and over that the festivals of God, the festivals of God are described in the context of times of renewal. Times of a spiritual fresh start. Times of a new beginning. Times of a recommitment. We've got to examine in our lives the recommitting that there is to be done. We've got to examine in our lives the things that we have to get rid of, that we might clean up spiritually and arise and go back to Bethel. And renew that relationship, renew that covenant, renew that first love. As we approach the Passover season, and as we think in terms of getting rid of the leavening and replacing it with unleavened bread, we need to understand that what God expects and what God desires goes beyond merely the physical. You see, it's the leavening of malice and wickedness. Christ talked about beware the leaven of the Pharisees, and beware the leaven of the Sadducees, and beware the leaven of the Herodians. He warned His disciples, you see, of spiritual leaven that insidiously can creep in and contaminate the people of God. For the Pharisees, religion was a hollow shell. It was an outward form that was devoid of inward reality. They went through the motions, but for the Pharisees, religion was form without substance. The Sadducees were leavened with the secular intellectualism of the world around them. They had absorbed the Greek intellectual culture. The Herodians were sensual. They had entered into, they were the followers of Herod. They were after money and power and all of the things that pertain to the physical, to the lusts of the flesh. You know, these things, whether of outward form as a substitute for inward reality, whether of secular worldly intellectualism and skepticism, or whether just, worldly sensuality, power, money, sex, those things have always had the capacity and the tendency to come in and to leaven the people of God. We can't afford to absorb any of those leavens. We've got to get rid of the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of the Sadducees, the leaven of the Herodians, to replace it with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, where we believe God and we walk with God. We have faith and confidence in the Word of God and in the promises of God and in the reality of who God is and what He says. And that our obedience to God goes beyond empty, hollow form, and it is form and substance. Form and substance. You need both. You see them setting forms out here. They're going to build a bridge on an overpass. And they set forms. And then they pour concrete into those forms. Now, which would you rather leave out, the form or the concrete? leave out the form and you pour the concrete and all you got's a blob? Doesn't do anybody any good. What if you just set up the form and leave out the concrete? I'd hate to be the first guy that drove over the bridge. You see, on the one hand, it looks good, but it has no substance. It has no enduring power. On the other, it's all the strength, all the power, all the energy is dissipated out in every direction. It takes form and substance. You get rid of either one and you've got a mess. God gives us the form of His law, but there's also to be the substance of sincerity and truth. You see, the two go hand in hand. It's not just an academic knowing of the truth. It's a sincere, heartfelt obedience to that truth. If you have sincerity without truth, you're just sincerely wrong. If you have truth without sincerity, all you have is those who are ever learning and never able to really come to that knowledge because it's purely an academic, well, I know something you don't. No, God is after an inner substance that is molded and shaped by the outward form of His truth. He wants us to replace the leaven of malice and wickedness, to get rid of the things that leaven, that puff up in our life. As we approach God at this festival season, just a matter of 3 weeks away, less than 3 weeks away, as we approach God and we begin to get our focus on this festival season, brethren, we need to search and examine our lives. We need to look in the corners of our lives. We need to examine that before God. Because as we come before God at the Passover, we're told that God commends His love toward us and that while we were yet sinners, Christ has died for us. It's the meaning of the Passover, but going right on, and that's in Romans chapter 5 and Romans chapter 6. Verse 1, what are we told? What then? Shall we continue in sin, that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? You see, because Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us, let us therefore keep the feast. Let us go forward. Let us come out of Egypt. We were passed over. We were exempted from death so that we would now have the freedom and the wherewithal to come out, to leave Egypt behind and go, to enter into a relationship with our God. Brethren, as we come to this point, as we approach the spring festival season, we ought to take note of it. And we need to take note of what God told Jacob. Arise and go up to Bethel. We all, as we examine our lives, we need in our lives to arise, to go up to our Bethel, to renew and revive that covenant into which we entered with our God. Very good.